Okay, so hello. What I want to kind of start out with is I just want to mention that time is, or at least our perception of time, is very culturally influenced. It's very amorphous and kind of abstract. And I kind of want to first start talking about what types of time there is. And it's probably fair to say that all of us here, or at least most of us, have a linear perception of time, and that we believe that events take place sequentially, and that the future is ahead of us, and that the past is behind us. But there are other types of time. There's cyclical, which is listed here, and there's also like reverse time and like spatially oriented perceptions of time. But we're not going to really touch on those because they're too complicated and we don't really have the time for that as well. But I'm going to first I want to talk about how cyclical and linear time are both cultural, and those perceptions of time are influenced by how we live our lives. The ancient Egyptians had a cyclical perception of time, and this is due to, if I were to say, two things. The first is the routine flooding of the Nile River, which was their main source of sustenance and livelihood. If the Nile River were to flood, and it did flood, at the same time every single year, that would reinforce or at least create an idea of cyclical time, especially if you don't have something like a watch telling you exactly what time it is. And another thing that would probably reinforce this idea of cyclical time is that ancient Egypt lasted for a super long time. I mean, it lasted for like over 3,000 years. It's if you were living in ancient Egypt and you had like the lifespan of 60 something years, and that's, I think, stretching it, it would be fair to assume that time is cyclical because the land that you're living on has been like that since before you were born, and chances are it's going to be like that after you die as well. Whereas in the United States and in Europe, but I'm going to be talking about the United States mostly, we have a linear perception of time, and for two similar reasons to ancient Egypt's reasons why they had a cyclical perception of time. In America, time is measured outside of the number on our phone telling us the time. It's measured by development. And this is historically too. The US has always had this idea of expansion and building. If you've lived in a city for 20 years, chances are within those 20 years you'll have seen buildings built. And that's one way of perceiving time. And it's harder to tear down buildings, at least in a legal way, than it is to build buildings. And that impacts our perception of linear time. Additionally, in America, time is literally money, in that the vast majority of people in the United States earn money by the hour. So, in theory, the more time that you spend working in America, the more money that you will make. And that should make, and this isn't necessarily true, this is theoretical, it should make like the more time you spend, the more wealth you will accrue. And that impacts a linear perception of time. But even then, linear time can have a huge amount of variance within it. For example, the calendar is really good example of how linear time can differ. We all probably adopt the Gregorian calendar with our 12 months and around 30 days each month. But what I mainly want to talk about is that in the Gregorian calendar, our days roll over at midnight. When it hits midnight on Monday, it becomes Tuesday. When it hits midnight on Tuesday, it becomes Wednesday. And each day is exactly 24 hours long. But in the Hebrew calendar, that isn't necessarily the case. And in Judaism, there is also a conception of linear time, but in the Hebrew calendar, days, instead of starting at midnight, they start at sundown. So the days go from sundown to sundown. And what that means is that depending on the season and depending on where you are, a day isn't necessarily going to be 24 hours long. There's going to be variance in how long a day is, because sometimes the sun will set earlier than on other days. And that creates a linear perception of time, which is slightly more flexible and less fixed, because each day is not exactly the same when it comes to length. And building off of that, if you live super far up north, and some of you might, I don't know, during the winter or the summer, the amount of daylight you get varies super drastically, especially if you're really close to the North Pole, in that sometimes during the winter, in fact, most of the time during the winter, you're not going to have sunlight. You might have it for an hour a day at best. And in the summer, the opposite applies, where most of the day, except for maybe an hour, is going to be as if it were noon. And if you didn't have a watch, if you had no way to actually measure time except for maybe the positioning of the sun or the moon in the sky, that's going to impact your linear perception of time. A personal anecdote is that when I would visit Stockholm in Sweden when I was a kid, I would not fall asleep until something like 11:30 when it started to get dark. And that's a pretty big difference for a kid who'd normally fall asleep at 8, and I didn't use a watch either. So that impacted my perception of linear time. And this also applies to something I think we all experience, unless you're in, I think, Arizona or something, which is daylight saving time, in that all of a sudden, time switches to be an hour later or an hour earlier. And if we were to look at this from a timeless lens, without this construct of time, we would be like, why the hell are we doing things an hour earlier or an hour later all of a sudden? This is how it is. It's how time works. And that impacts our linear perception of time, is being told that time moves depending on the time of year. And one more thing that it can impact our linear perception of time is socialization. You may have a friend who is always late to everything, or you may have a friend who sometimes likes to overstay their welcome when they're over. And that's likely because that friend prioritizes socialization over deadlines, which in I think many people in a linear, I should probably specify like European American linear perception of time believe in sharp deadlines. Like if you're going to do something at 7 p.m., you're going to show up within 5 minutes of 7 p.m. It's pretty standard. But some people might show up maybe 20 or 30 minutes later because they believe that ending a conversation naturally is more important than cutting off a conversation early to go attend something. And that creates a linear perception of time that, which is a bit like the Hebrew calendar, is a bit superfluous and abstract and is ever changing. And basically the point I'm saying by bringing up all of these examples is that linear time can change drastically depending on cultural context and religious and geographic context, which I would argue are all elements of culture, which is a bit redundant. But now I'm going to hand it over to Jay